Armand, late last year, we talked about the remake of The Color Purple, which was a musical. It was ostensibly a remake of the Steven Spielberg 1985 film based on the Alice Walker novel. But in that successive series of adaptations, it just got poorer and poorer. Now, during our conversation of the remake of Color Purple, you brought up a film that I'd never seen before, and I don't even know if I'd heard about it. I knew the song, but it was called Pennies from Heaven, directed by Herbert Ross from 1981. And you referenced that as the much better version of whatever they're trying to do in The Color Purple, as far as these giant set pieces and these kind of fantasy musical, numbers interpreting the characters' emotions. Now, I've since seen Pennies from Heaven, and I'm really excited to talk to you about it because the movie was a flop when it came out in '81. I think a lot of the people who were involved with it, including the star, Steve Martin, even the head of MGM who released it, were surprised that it didn't resonate with audiences because they all thought that it was kind of a landmark piece of art. It was critically acclaimed at the time, but from what I had read, it made $9 million at the box office on a $22 million budget. So, yikes. What I want to talk about today is not only Pennies from Heaven, but I want to talk about how you encountered Pennies from Heaven and try and figure out what the hell happened. Why isn't this movie talked about by everyone all the time? Because it's magical.
Okay, well, let's see. Let's start with the director, Herbert Ross. So Herbert Ross was a figure with whom I had been familiar with for a long time. I believe he started out as a choreographer on Broadway, and I don't know the background. Somehow he knew the right people, and he was hired to direct the musical sequences for the 1968 film Funny Girl. The dramatic sequences were directed by the great Hollywood veteran William Wyler. Somehow, Herbert Ross was tasked with directing the musical numbers of Funny Girl. Funny Girl is a decent film. The dramatic scenes are good because William Wyler is a great director and knows how to handle actors. And as Pauline Kael said, he presented Barbra Streisand on a pillow because she does nothing wrong acting-wise in Funny Girl because she's got the great William Wyler protecting her, presenting her to the world on a pillow, so to speak. So the dramatic scenes of Funny Girl are good because they're done by a pro. The musical numbers in Funny Girl are also very entertaining, but also they show a unique ability in directing movie musicals, and they're directed by this guy named Herbert Ross, who was a Broadway choreographer. From there, Herbert Ross went on. He made his directorial debut for an entire film the very next year with the musical version of Goodbye, Mr. Chips, that starred Peter O'Toole and Petula Clark. Have you seen that, Ian?
No.
Oh, I should catch
Let's,
that too. It's pretty wonderful.
well,
Yeah.
let me just say, it wasn't until very recently, like within the last 10 years, that I even cared about musicals. It's a genre I'm not that familiar with, but I'm catching up with and kind of falling in love with, partially because I'm discovering movies like this. But yeah, let go on, please.
Okay, so Goodbye, Mr. Chips, the musical remake with Peter O'Toole and Petula Clark, was Herbert Ross's directorial debut, and he went from there to directing other movies and being a successful filmmaker. My God, am I right? I think he directed Barbra Streisand's The Owl and the Pussycat, which is a comedy from 1970. I think he did that, and then I believe his next film was Play It Again, Sam, the film version of the Woody Allen Broadway play. The film version starred Woody Allen, and it's also brought Woody Allen from Broadway with his co-star Diane Keaton. It's a decent film that nobody talks about anymore. It's a decent film. And Herbert Ross became a successful filmmaker, making pretty good films that were also box office successes. Probably his best known year as a filmmaker was 1977. He made two films that came out in '77. One was the mysteriously popular The Goodbye Girl with Richard Dreyfuss and Marsha Mason. But also that year, there was a film called The Turning Point that starred Shirley MacLaine and Anne Bancroft and Mikhail Baryshnikov, a film set in the world of ballet. Herbert Ross was married to a ballet dancer named Nora Kay, who also worked on all his films as an artistic advisor. So I had been following Herbert Ross's career as a director because he made films that I liked. In 1980, he made an extraordinary film called Nijinsky, starring Alan Bates as Nijinsky's mentor, Sergei Diaghilev. Great figure from the Paris Opera in the early 20th century. It was the first serious drama that Herbert Ross directed. Also a film that I respect and take seriously, with another superb performances by Alan Bates as Diaghilev. Herbert Ross is on a roll. Somehow or other, the very next year, in 1981, he comes up with Pennies from Heaven. And I guess he was on a roll, and he was doing things artistically like he had never done before. And the kind of artistic experimentation that's all over, that's absolutely on the screen in Pennies from Heaven. This must have been a moment when Herbert Ross decided that I know what art is. Well, he just did a movie about Diaghilev. I know what art is, and I'm going to show the world what art is, and I'm ready to do it. And he hired great people to work with him, particularly behind the scenes, behind the camera. The cinematographer Gordon Willis, who by that point was certainly very well known for having photographed the Godfather films, and also the production designer named Ken Adam, who was certainly well known, particularly for designing all the James Bond films of the 1960s. A great artist, clearly. And so Herbert Ross was ready, and I was ready for him in December of 1981. And so I went to see, anticipated, in fact, Pennies from Heaven. That's how I came to see it. And even though I was not disappointed, even though I expected after Nijinsky, I expected Herbert Ross to do something good and something artistic. Even I was amazed at what he had come up with in Pennies from Heaven. At the time, also, I was somewhat aware of Dennis Potter's work, usually through PBS broadcasts of the BBC series Pennies from Heaven. But I think I looked at it and was not interested, so I didn't watch it. But I was aware of who Dennis Potter was, and somewhat interested in his approach to popular culture. How he liked to reinterpret popular culture in his own way, using postmodern ideas about art, about art, and about well, there's a word I'm hesitating to use, but the word is semiology. This is a term I learned in school about how to interpret language through signs. Semiology means a study of signs, and this is an idea that came up started in the 60s with people like Roland Barthes, but it became very popular among French intellectuals in the 60s, 70s, and it entered the American academia in the late 70s and early 1980s. So the things that Dennis Potter was doing and using popular music and pop imagery, and using pop imagery as ways to interpret the way society was structured, the way human beings lived, was something that Dennis Potter was interested in, although I was not interested in the TV series Pennies from Heaven. But when I saw the movie, the Herbert Ross movie, all those ideas were made very clear, very graspable, in fact, and exciting.
Have you, in the intervening decades, gone back and watched Dennis Potter's BBC series from '78?
No, I have not.
No? Okay.
No, I'm content with the Herbert Ross film.
I'm curious now because, the original version took place in London and I guess kind of a rural town on the outskirts. This version is transplanted to 1934 Chicago, and sort of like central southern Illinois. At one point, Steve Martin, who's the star of the film, he talks about going on a trip down to Geneva. So it's one of those cases where, much like a film like Civil War that just came out, and Alex Garland is a Brit who's kind of looking and commenting on sort of an idea of American politics. For me, it didn't quite work because I didn't feel like he had kind of grasped the nuances of what's going on in the landscape. Whereas I watched Pennies from Heaven, and I feel like this feels so authentically Chicago, so authentically Depression era. Even some of the, I don't know if they're modern ideas to 1981 that were transposed onto these Depression era characters, but like the relational dynamics and even the sexual politics felt very authentic to a time and place that wasn't necessarily, London. It didn't feel like, oh, this is an outsider interpreting Americans. It felt very authentic. So I don't know how he pulled that off, but yeah, it's this movie felt very. I felt like I was living with the characters. Part of that is the production design, as you mentioned. It's astounding, and I'm frankly jealous that you got to see this on the big screen, because I was watching this on my laptop from an Amazon rental, thinking, why can't I go out and see this at a theater somewhere in America? This has to be shown again.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, there's no better way to watch cinema than on the big screen. So I was very fortunate, I was very blessed at that to be in the right place in the right time for Pennies from Heaven. So in a beautiful theater here in New York City that's no longer in existence, called the Ziegfeld. Ziegfeld, by the way, it opened in 1970, and its opening attraction was David Lean's Ryan's Daughter. A large screen theater, perfect theater to show films by great visual filmmakers, by great cinematic masters like David Lean and this period of Herbert Ross. So you have something to envy, because it was the right spot, it was the right time, and it's visually a great film. I don't know how authentic it is to the United States in the 1930s, but it uses American songs, American radio culture, American sheet music culture. It uses all that in a way that is genuine and authentic. I was not there during the Depression. My sense of the Depression, which comes largely from other movies made during the 1930s, it's quite different from what we see in Herbert Ross's film. I take Herbert Ross's film as a stylized version of the Depression. It doesn't have to be absolutely realistic to me, but I certainly understand and appreciate and agree with what I would call its Americanness. It has a real sense of what American culture is, even though I think I'm not sure that it's true to the Depression, but that's minor.
Well,
it's a piece of art.
Sure. I mean, I guess it was a clumsy, I think, way for me to articulate it, but it felt like someone who was of the culture, maybe not necessarily of the time period, because even he probably wasn't of that of that time period necessarily, or at least old enough to write about it. But it did feel like someone who was of the culture commenting on the culture rather than an outsider kind of looking in. And that's why that's one of the reasons I'm
sure.
and that's one of the reasons I'm curious to see the British version, just to see how different the translations are, and to see perhaps if maybe they're just, the cultures were so intertwined at that time that it was basically just renaming London for Chicago and different street signs or something.
It could be, but you put that well. It could be, but here's a tangential thought. When the excellent American filmmaker John Huston made his first movie musical a few years later in the mid 80s, a musical version of the Broadway show Annie, which I think is kind of a disastrous film. And there's a particularly annoying sequence in it where Little Orphan Annie and Daddy Warbucks, where they go to Radio City Music Hall to see a movie. They go to see Greta Garbo's Camille. And the way the way John Huston films this sequence, it makes me angry to even think about it. I thought, this is so fake. This is so fake to the 1930s, so false to American pop culture, and false to the Depression era. And John Huston was there. How could he not have got? How could he have gotten this so wrong in Annie? Herbert Ross gets it right, even though it's a stylized version of 30s America.
It is a stylized is a great word to use. It doesn't feel overly stylized. It doesn't feel cute.
Right.
When we are in the real world, where Arthur Parker is the Steve Martin character, he's married to Jessica Harper's character, who I'd only seen her from Suspiria. So to see her in this other dramatic role, I thought, was quite a revelation, 40 plus years on. But he's a sheet music salesman, an unsuccessful sheet music salesman who wants to open essentially a record record store. But his wife, who, they don't have much of a sex life. They're not, very close, but she's got she comes from some amount of money. She's got an inheritance that she could give to her husband to open up this store, but she knows it's a terrible idea. And so that's one bit of tension. One day, Arthur meets in a shop that he's trying to sell sheet music. He meets Bernadette Peters' character, Eileen, a school teacher who he falls in love with. He ends up getting with her, I'll say reluctantly, because, wow, I don't know how much sensibilities have changed since 1981. I know there's a lot of talk about consent and appropriateness, today, in a lot of cases, rightfully so. But I was watching the scene where Arthur and Eileen were on the couch when she finds out that he's married, and he turns that around into an opportunity to put the moves on her. It's an assault. I mean, it's kind of played for laughs, I guess, but the tastelessness, I'll just say it, of the giant cartoon cutout heart rolling into frame and framing these two the characters as there's pretty much a rape happening on screen. I don't know how the film rebounded from that, but it did. I think because from that point on, it's not that Arthur becomes a villain, I don't think, but he's painted as this progressively more pathetic, big scale dreamer. And at that point, it's when Eileen kind of starts to come into her own and becomes a completely different character. This movie took me places that I didn't know that a story could. So by the end of it, I was completely floored. Now, I want to ask you, when you watched this in 1981, did you have that kind of reaction to that scene? Or I don't quite know what to make of it, because it's not funny. It's not sufficiently scary in the way that I think if a filmmaker had thought, I really want to highlight this as a bad thing, I don't think it's quite presented that way. But it's just kind of there with that weird tag of the heart rolling in and framing these two people.
All right. Well, I want to say that it is funny. I found it to be funny. And here's why. Here's why. But first, you used a very powerful, scary word there, the word rape. Have you ever seen the Richard Lester film, The Knack and How to Get It?
No.
Probably not. Richard Lester, best known for having directed the Beatles movie A Hard Day's Night, is a great satirical American filmmaker who's mostly made films in England, even though he directed a number of the 1970s, 80s Superman movies, Christopher Reeve Superman movies, and Richard Lester's film version of a British play called The Knack. He used the actress Rita Tushingham as the star of that film, and in the film she plays a young English girl dealing with young men on the make, so to speak, and she uses that powerful word, rape. She uses it as a kind of trigger, and she throughout the story of The Knack, she uses that word as a constant trigger. So I bring that up to say to you, careful about that word, because all these, it's a very powerful term to use. I don't think the scene that you're discussing in Pennies from Heaven, I never took that to be a rape scene. As the story plays out, we discover that Eileen has sexual agency. that Eileen wants Arthur as much as he wants her. But the interesting thing about the way Herbert Ross stages that scene, you mentioned that the heart-shaped, Valentine-shaped symbol that comes to frame the start of their coupling. It's a very interesting device. And why I said that scene could be taken to be funny is because it's a Brechtian device. It's a device that lets the audience know, I think in a very Dennis Potter way, that here is the dirty deed, and we're putting a Valentine over this dirty deed because we know it's dirty. We know it's not necessary. We know it's lust, not love. And so Herbert Ross puts a Valentine over it, not because he's being ironic about rape, but because he's being ironic about love and the difference between love and lust. That's what the sign of the Valentine, the semiotics of the Valentine meant to me when I saw it. I thought, oh, this is a wink, because we know that Eileen has sexual agency and that Arthur is doing what she wants him to do.
Well,
it's not a date rape scenario, so careful of that word. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I'll stand by it.
That's my response. You had yours.
Well, but here's the thing. I think it's very interesting because you're right. She has sexual agency after that scene, because everything that we see of her character leading up to that moment, she's very naive. She's very kind of conservative and buttoned up and seems to not know a whole lot about men. After that scene, and this is where it gets kind of sticky because it feels like she comes into her own sexually after reluctantly having this first sexual encounter. She sort of discovers that she likes it and she becomes sexually adventurous, and she, opens herself up to some of Arthur's fantasies and shares in those fantasies, and indeed sticks by him towards the end of the film and talks about how much she loved him essentially from the first time that they met. I think that she was disappointed in his behavior, and that behavior revealed something to him or to her about his character that she wasn't so fond of. But later on in her experiences becoming a prostitute for a while, under the guidance, I guess, or threat of our Christopher Walken, who shows up in one of the most astounding dance sequences I've ever seen. After going through that and reconnecting with Arthur towards the end of the film, she's a much different person. She's more world weary, she's more powerful, and she sort of towers above Arthur in a lot of ways and shows him to be even more pathetic than we already assumed him to be. But in that moment, yes, he emotionally manipulates her. He ends up like crying on her shoulder, and in the process of that, feeling her up, going after her neck, pulling down her stockings and his pants, and she's saying, "No, Arthur, no, no, no." And I can't remember what she said, but in her protestations, because I was really kind of taken by this moment. I don't know, it's somewhere in here. He says, "Eileen, take the pain away," and she says, I'll try," and then the heart rolls in. There's nothing consensual necessarily about that. And it almost feels like a male-centric idea of, well, she just needs to get through it this one time to see how much she likes it, and then it'll be great. The movie takes that stance, I think, and it ends up working, but I could very much see a world in which it wouldn't.
Well, we probably disagree. We do disagree. The word consensual, I think that makes it's a different conversation. It's a different conversation than the film is beginning. I think it's a film. Well, we haven't said. Here's something we haven't said about it. It's a dark film. It's a cynical,
very, very dark. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think it's cynical, and in its cynicism, a term like consensual brings in an entirely different set of politics than enlightened folk like Herbert Ross and Nora Kay needed to use. They don't need that. They understand the complexity of of human interaction and human need. I'm going to stick by defending Herbert and Nora and their understanding as is ultimately shown of Eileen.
Look,
I don't
I'm
think
not.
I don't think that, go ahead.
I was saying I think we are in a higher level alignment in that they can tell whatever kind of story they want. And I think by using this device as a way of transforming, I think, both characters in the way that they do, I think it's very helpful. I'm just saying for me, watching this scene, I wasn't expecting it. And I think that if you don't want to use that word, that's fine. There are other euphemisms for it. And it is a very hard word. It is not the guy in the alley at knife point pulling some woman into the alley and having his way with her. But in the various permutations and I'd say evolution of our societal understanding of what sexual assault can be, I would say that this kind of qualifies. Now, I understand this was made, it's a movie from 40 plus years ago talking about an era that was, 50 years earlier than that. So who knows what the attitudes were and what they were trying to say. But ultimately, I can understand the scene and the moment because of where it takes the characters throughout the film. It is not a thing that happens that there's no consequences. In fact, I think it leads to the emergence of this character who starts off as very kind of mousy and much of a victim to a towering figure of ultimate power by the end. I do want to talk about that ending because I'm not quite sure how to interpret that, but yeah, we're kind of getting hung up on the one scene, and there's so many others to talk about. What was, I guess, had you seen other musicals in which the characters on screen, when they open their mouths to sing, they're not singing themselves; they are lip syncing to the old kind of standards of the time. I had not seen this before, at least I don't think. Usually musicals, the characters are doing their business and all of a sudden they break out into song as themselves. In this movie, it's almost like they've got a phonograph like right off the screen and Steve Martin is singing old standards. Had you encountered that before and was it jarring when you first saw that employed as a device here?
No, it wasn't jarring to me because, well, this is 1981. Uh, by then, put it this way, by then the world had seen Audrey Hepburn in My Fair Lady. It's seen Natalie Wood in West Side Story, where they are lip syncing to Marnie Nixon. So, a pop culturally, an audience familiar with popular culture is not disturbed, or Rita Hayworth singing to whoever it was in Gilda. We're not disturbed by the idea of lip syncing, and so it's an acceptable device.
Well, it's not just lip syncing. I mean, I understand an actor lip syncing to the song of someone who can sing and is supposed to be singing as that character. But what I'm talking about is it'd be like a musical today where Ryan Gosling is singing in La La Land instead of, him singing it. Someone is actually playing a song from the radio and it's coming out of his mouth. I mean, that's essentially what we're getting all throughout this film, right? That's not it's not Arthur Parker singing as Arthur Parker. He is singing the kind of the show, I guess the show tunes of the 1920s and 30s. They're coming out of his mouth, but it's not supposed to be him. It's a musical fantasy.
All right. Okay. I was going at it in a long way around, so to speak.
Okay.
It is not a shock that the performers were not using their own voices, because we know that happens in movies. That's not a shock. What's interesting, what's fascinating, what's extremely modern about it is that from the carefully recorded, carefully remastered sound recordings of those 1930s discs, those 1930s records, we understand that these are not the actors' voices. We understand that we're hearing vintage records. And we can accept that convention because we've seen lip syncing before. This is the point I was trying to get to. But also, what's exciting about it is that we know we're hearing records. We know we're watching lip syncing. This is, again, is a kind of Brechtian device. We know the artifice The artifice is all apparent. The artifice is unmistakable. The artifice is exciting. I'm going to stick to my guns too. I think that Valentine frame is exciting because it's artificial, because it is a commentary on the relationships that we're seeing before us, a relationship that need not be judged with that very, very powerful and difficult and dangerous word. What's fascinating about Pennies from Heaven as a movie is that it makes us aware of artifice. This is the semiotic structuralist thing about it. This is the Brechtian thing about it. Herbert Ross is using artifice all over the place, and he trusts that the audience is sophisticated enough to get it and not be thrown by it. He might have overjudged there because a lot of people were indeed thrown by it, but I wasn't, and neither were my film school friends. We weren't either, and neither were some reviewers. We got it. We got the artifice. We knew what the artifice was referring to, and enjoyed seeing the artifice played out. Played out why? Because in this dark, cynical film, it's all a commentary about social mores of the 1930s that are instructive, that should be instructive to us in 1981 and even today. This is what's really marvelous about the film, because it's a social commentary where the commentary is not obvious, but you're made to feel it, you're made to think it as the narrative continues. So you think doubly. One thinks doubly while watching Pennies from Heaven. This is what's marvelous about it. You know you're watching cinema, but you're also watching a replay of American pop music culture, pop music history. These things happen both at once, and that probably through some untutored, some unsophisticated film watchers. But that's their problem, and also the problem of the failure of their own schooling, their own school teachers. I had good school teachers, thank God. so I wasn't thrown by it. I was prepared for it by my education.
Yeah, I know Steve Martin had said that he was very fond of the film, even though it had flopped, and he said that he thinks that there were people out there who did get it. He said that people who didn't, he didn't call them morons, but it was something something similar to that. But I mean, talking about the semiotics, I mean, there's the scene early on where Arthur goes to the bank because he wants money for this record shop, and he gets turned down by the I guess the loan officer, the bank president, whoever it was, and they go into this elaborate dance sequence where they're performing together. And there's like this giant, I can't remember if it was a quarter or a dollar coin. It comes rolling out onto the screen, and it looks like something that they would have done as a digital effect today. But I imagine they had to build that damn thing and coordinate that with all the dancers and the choreography. The movie feels big, and no two dance numbers are the same. They have different costumes, they have different sensibilities, different meanings, different settings throughout the movie. So every one is exciting. There are some musicals that I've seen where I think, oh God, here's another dance number coming. But in Pennies from Heaven, it's unevenly paced, so it's very front loaded. And then there's a middle stretch where there's no music at all. It's all the drama of the real world. And then there's sort of this escape back into fantasy as the characters sort of need to get away from the darkness that is encroaching on their real lives. Because Arthur gets Eileen pregnant after that one night. He goes back to his wife, Joan, and tries to make it work with her. She ends up giving him the money to open the record shop, and he disappears into that business and then goes back to see Eileen when she's pregnant. She's been fired from her job as a school teacher because it's unacceptable that she's a single, pregnant lady. He says he's going to make it work. They decide to eventually run away together, and that causes all sorts of other problems, not to mention the fact that Arthur also skips out on Joni at one point, ends up traveling down to central Illinois, or is somewhere outside the outskirts of Chicago. They reuse the same bridge like 3 or 4 times in this movie for sort of a not quite Chicago location. But he encounters this blind teenager who he kind of wants to put the moves on her too, but she refuses, and he doesn't push the matter. So he's not a complete, animal. But what he does do is he drops a pack of Camel cigarettes on the ground. Later, that girl is assaulted and murdered by a hobo that Arthur had previously picked up and kind of engaged with earlier in the movie. And he'd sung the title song, Pennies from Heaven, in a beautiful sequence involving a diner where the walls open up and he's singing, singing in the rain. But Arthur's ultimately framed for that girl's murder. And Joan becomes complicit in his framing by helping to kind of give him up to the cops because she can't believe that he's kind of stepped on her again. And ultimately, Arthur, the law catches up with him. Now, the final sequence of the movie, and we can kind of talk spoilers because it's a much older film, and I don't think that knowing exactly how it ends can take away from the experience of seeing it, because this is something that needs to be experienced. But he performs Pennies from Heaven almost as a soliloquy, standing, at the gallows. He's got the noose like right next to his head, and then it cuts to him encountering Eileen, and everything he kind of runs. He's in an underground, gray, almost like a cell, and he encounters Eileen, and she's all the lighting is in red. There's another dance number. All the performers are in these red sequins, and it's a very hot, very orangey kind of a vibe. So I'm wondering that the underground portion, sort of it, is that from where he dropped after he was hung, and now he's kind of running into his own damnation. But then after the music fades, we pan up to the bright blue sky and through the clouds. And then we get the line of, "Hello, my name is Arthur," his introduction to Eileen. So I don't know where he ended up, or if the film is even trying to tell us that he ended up anywhere. But how did you interpret this? Is this his punishment? Is he being rewarded for being a dreamer? I don't know what's happening here.
It's been a while since I've seen it myself, so I'm going to have some trouble recalling that ending, or rather recalling what that ending means. I will say, in memory, I took it as a kind of transcendence, in some sense, a transcendence through popular culture, where the dark, cynical, seamy life that we live is somehow transformed through popular culture, not just the old songs, but also through Herbert Ross's reference to old movie choreography and old Hollywood musical numbers. I take it to be a kind of transcendence, and it worked for me that way again, as a kind of Brechtian device. Just before Arthur is hanged, that's a soliloquy, as you say, standing at the gallows with his head next to the noose before it's put over his neck. This is a lovely composition, but it's a familiar composition too, because it comes from The Beggar's Opera, which is a film that Laurence Olivier made with Peter Brook back in the 1950s. The Beggar's Opera is, of course, the source of the Threepenny Opera, of Brecht and Kurt Weill's Threepenny Opera. So Herbert Ross knows this, and probably Dennis Potter knows it too, but Herbert Ross knows it, and he brings it into his version of Dennis Potter's idea, conceit, and it makes it work, and again in a Brechtian fashion. That's how it made sense. That's the sense it made to me when I first saw it, and subsequent viewings, which have been a few years back now. But it works that way for me.
It does. And to your point, there's a line where Arthur says, "I want to live in a world where the songs come true." He's a character that we've seen in movies that have come after this, and probably some before it. He's a dreamer. He lives in a fantasy world, but I think typically those characters are presented as more, I'll use the term, likable, more relatable, the kind of people that you want to be like. The big heart and the wide eyes. Arthur has the wide eyes, and I think his version of a big heart, but he's a tremendously flawed guy. He's kind of a loser, but there's something, I don't know if it's what's on the page, or if it's Steve Martin's delivery of it, or what I bring to this performance because of what I've seen of Steve Martin and his comedy and some of his other dramatic roles. But I was kind of rooting for him, even though I found it to be kind of a pathetic character, a phrase I've used a lot on this show, unfortunately. But yeah, there's even in his darkest moments, even after he's dead, I still find him kind of, like I'm glad I spent 2 hours with with Arthur Parker.
Well, I mean, it's clear that Arthur did not kill the blind girl, so his hanging is a kind of injustice. McKeith in The Beggar's Opera, but it's an injustice because he didn't kill the girl, but he's not a likable fellow. He A man like that could very well have gone to the movies to see movie musicals like Gold Diggers in 1933, where that big giant coin you talked about first appeared, was first made in Hollywood. He sells sheet music, so he's familiar with pop music, and I guess we can say that he likes pop music. But the life he lives a dog's life. He's a prick, but he's also an American character, which means that he has experienced American pop culture, wonderful movie musicals in the 1930s. He sells sheet music, so we can surmise that he probably likes music and knows something about music. He knows the rich expression that there has been of complex human emotions in popular music, even though the life he lives is a low life, is a dog's life. This makes him an interesting figure for a movie that comes out in 1981, and I think Herbert Ross's Pennies from Heaven is one of the high points of that period that I think of as the American Renaissance, beginning in 1967 with films like Bonnie and Clyde and Point Blank and Persona and The Graduate and In Cold Blood, where American filmmakers had learned a lot from European films and were applying those artistic innovations to new ways of understanding American experience. And so you wind up with not nice characters like Jack Nicholson's character in Five Easy Pieces, who's also a prick and a no good person. But we see and identify with his own confusions and his own challenges, his own difficulties in trying as being a human being, if not a good one, if certainly even a bad human being. Arthur's a bad guy. Even though he did not commit the murder, he's still a bad guy. But but one of the things that's difficult about that what proved to be difficult about Pennies from Heaven to some viewers is that they're not accustomed to movies in which the characters are not likable. Arthur's not likable, but Arthur has got all this wonderful pop culture in his head, and he's expressing himself in his imagination, but he's a bad guy. It's kind of this is part of what's fascinating about the movie, even though you have to call it a movie musical, but it's not a happy film. But it uses the irony of movie musicals to tell some truths about sex, about sex, and about morality, and this is what's good about it.
Well, I think there's something really deep there in what you just said. He's not a good guy, but I think it's because he's got this love of pop culture, of musicals, which generally center around positivity, life, love, the kind of the bigger themes, that you almost want to transcribe that love for that onto the character of the person. So if he loves this stuff and he responds to it, there has to be something good in him, but he's just completely flawed. He's dealing with, as you mentioned, Jack Nicholson in Five Easy Pieces, the messiness of being a human being and all those complexities. As far as the sort of the semiotics, I don't know if I'm reading way too much into this, but you mentioned Bonnie and Clyde. There's the scene where Eileen and Arthur are cornered by the police. You see, they're standing next to the car, that kind of old classic car. The cops approach them. I immediately thought of Bonnie and Clyde. And I thought of Arthur Penn, who directed Bonnie and Clyde. I thought of Arthur and Eileen, A&E, Adam and Eve. There's a line about how, did you know that it was really Adam that had tempted Eve and not the other way around? I think those kinds of interesting sexual dynamics play the way out in this film, in that it is Arthur who ultimately awakens Eileen to become the person she's going to be. And in the end, she ends up becoming more of the, I guess, Eve, the temptress, the lording over figure that, we might traditionally understand that dynamic to be. So yeah, there's a lot going on here. And if it sounds like, to folks who've never seen this movie before, if it sounds, heavy and dark and unpleasant, it is heavy and dark, but it is not unpleasant. As I mentioned, Christopher Walken shows up. His name's in the opening credits, I think, but he doesn't show up until basically almost the end of the movie. Uh, and when he does, he plays a pimp, but he does this amazing dance scene in a bar that is so funny and so revealing, that, I mean, I'd never seen Christopher Walken like this. I know he did that dance video back in like the late 90s or something, but uh, again, I feel like this is a movie that could be released today and talked about and argued over, the politics and all that stuff. But I think it could be a giant hit because it is sort of a postmodern dark musical. It's the antithesis of what people think musicals are, while also being a great homage to classic musicals and music of the past.
Well, all that's true. But I have some cynicism in me. I don't know that audiences today are yet sophisticated enough to accept a film like this. It's too, it's beyond them. And I think in terms of morality and politics, people have started to be rather simplistic without being intelligent. And I'm not sure that this film could ever be a hit. Certainly not in this era. I kind of doubt it. But it's a wonderfully complex film. Uh, let's say some more about the complexity of uh, of seeing performers like Christopher Walken, who we later, much later in the Weapons of Choice video that he did for Spike Jones, where he's dancing
That's
and
right.
floating in the air. At that point, we already know that Christopher Walken can dance because of Pennies from Heaven, but it was kind of shocking to see him dance as a pimp in this movie, and that's an interesting number too, musical number, because the dance that you said funny, funny really, the dance is rather lascivious, and it doesn't try to
It's
disguise the
not.
fact that this is also a bad guy pimp, and he's dancing in front of these large projections, sexual, quasi pornographic projections of women. Uh, it's a very odd dance sequence. Uh, we're kind of surprised to see Christopher Walken dance, but then the context in which we see him dancing on top of a bar, I believe it begins, or maybe at one point during the dance.
Yeah.
It's not a happy musical number. It's rather dirty, in fact.
Well, here's the thing. It is dirty. When I say funny, I'm not saying it's a laugh out loud like knee slapper, but he does go from this, very nice
Mm-hmm.
era, appropriate suit to being literally in his boxer shorts. And when he turns around at the end, he's got a giant cartoon heart with the name Lulu on it, which is the name that the fake name Eileen had given him. Now, that is this kind of sweeping romantic notion. And it isn't until, I think, after that musical number that we realize exactly who he is. Because we understand he's some sort of a seedy, perhaps underworld figure, but we don't know that he's a pimp until it's after that musical number when he turns around, he's got the heart on it. It pops back to reality, and he says to Eileen, "You're not a tease, are you? Because I'll cut your face." And at that moment, Eileen, you can see on Bernadette Peters' face this perfect transition from, "Oh, this is kind of a nice, dangerous guy who's buying me a drink," to, "I am now officially in trouble." And it's wonderful. It's very, I don't know. I think it's very modern. You say this movie couldn't work today. You may be right, but if you look at a movie like La La Land from 10 years ago or whatever it was, there's a lot of backlash to that because it's a big, cheesy Hollywood musical. I think there might be an appetite for the anti-musical, possibly. Not saying to remake this, hell no, but it could stand to have a reinterpretation or revisiting, maybe.
Oh, I don't know, Ian. God, why did you bring up La La Land, which is a horrible film,
Hey,
very
hey,
poorly
hey.
done. I have a feeling you're a La La Land liker, but I just want to remake the point that I don't think Pennies from Heaven could be a success today, be popular today, because a culture that could produce a movie like La La Land is not sophisticated enough to accept or understand the sophistication of Pennies from Heaven. La La Land, for me, being a movie made by people who don't understand the movie musical genre and don't have the talent to bluff it. Uh, it's a wonderful genre that takes some kind of appreciation in order to accept. And I think La La Land proves that appreciation is gone from our culture. But it's still an interesting film, and still a film that people, that millennials need to see and need to understand. Uh, if only because of its connection to our cultural history. We didn't at all talk about the many references that Herbert Ross makes, not just to Hollywood musicals and the platters of the Depression era, but also to painters like Edward Hopper and
Yes.
Reginald Marsh, and all those clear cultural references are a way that Herbert Ross wants us, by which Herbert Ross wants us to understand American pop culture and how it expresses the complexity of American life. Reginald Marsh and Edward Hopper did not paint happy scenes, and so their paintings are recreated in this movie for that reason, because Herbert Ross understands how richly complex popular culture can be, and that movie musicals can not just express joy but also express more difficult emotions as well.
Let me just, I want to say something because Nighthawks, the Hopper painting, has been done to death in pop culture. It's a meme, it's probably been done on The Simpsons like a million times. But when that establishing shot shows up in Pennies from Heaven, it's the only time that I think I've seen it used effectively, to the point where I almost felt like Edward Hopper had painted Nighthawks as an homage to Pennies from Heaven. It is so
Mhm.
thematically on point that I wanted to stand up and applaud, but my laptop would have fallen onto the floor and broken. Um,
It's
but no, you
wonderful. Let me
yeah.
say to you, at the Ziegfeld Theater, when that shot appeared on screen, I think there were gasps in the audience because the recreation of Hopper was so precise, and it's really a stunning image. I guess you could say it was stolen from Hopper. Uh, Herbert Ross owns it now.
Yeah,
not really, but it's a stunning image to appear on a big screen. By the way.
for
Um,
sure.
so again, I also wanted to return to the idea of the American Renaissance, where American filmmakers, having learned a lot from the European art film masters, were able to do more sophisticated and challenging things in cinema. And the Hopper references is one, the Brechtian references are another. But also, this is a period of where we have complicated characters like Arthur and like Joan and like Eileen, but everybody was ready for it. Herbert Ross was ready for it. Uh, Steve Martin was ready for it. Bernadette Peters was ready for it. Um, uh, uh, the Suspiria girl, whose name I'm forgetting.
Jessica Harper.
Jessica Harper was ready for it. And Jessica Harper, I have to get in the plug, showed that she herself has a superb singing voice from Brian De Palma's Phantom of the Opera. Another movie musical from the period of the American Renaissance that is also very complex, that also has cultural references, obviously, to Goethe's Faust, the same way Herbert Ross makes references to, and I got it now, it didn't come to me before, but you talk about the ending production number. It's kind of bathed in red. It's like Don Juan in Hell, actually. It's a movie made by intelligent people who got a chance to show their intelligence in Hollywood at long last.
Well, look, I think there is an appetite. La La Land has gotten a lot of backlash, just to bring it back to that.
Okay.
I know it was, but I think there's a big enough appetite of people, maybe not big enough to support, a giant musical of this scale, but maybe a re-release of some kind. But there's enough people who hate La La Land because it's cheesy and perhaps it doesn't quite know what it's doing. I, was a fan of it when I first saw it, but then again, I hadn't seen a lot of musicals. So now that I'm more well versed, I might be able to go back and look at it in a different way. But I feel like there's enough people who didn't buy into the candy coatedness of La La Land, who might be thirsting for something that's like, I want a musical, but I want something dark and gritty and real. I don't think it gets more dark, gritty, and real, despite the fantastical elements, which reminded me of the HBO series Dream On for some reason, than Pennies from Heaven. So I think we'll have to leave it there.
May I make one more point, please?
Of course.
An anti-La La Land point.
Yeah.
Certainly one of the greatest films of all time is a movie called Umbrellas of Cherbourg by Jacques Demy. Jacques Demy is who Damien Chazelle insulted with La La Land. He was imitating Jacques Demy and had no clue how to do it. I just want to say that because it needs to be said and never forgotten. Once you see any Jacques Demy film, and particularly Umbrellas of Cherbourg or The Young Girls of Rochefort, you will always be angry at Damien Chazelle. Once you know what he ripped off and once you know what he insulted. But to the point of millennial audiences having lost any understanding of their cultural heritage and any appreciation for complex art, this brings us back to the color purple, or as I like to call it now, the colored purple musical movie. And that moment where the Celie and Shug characters go to the movies and dance a la Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers from the 1930s. A disgraceful scene in many ways because it made their relationship too obvious, too explicit, and it was indeed a travesty of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers that Herbert Ross and Steve Martin and Bernadette Peters are careful not to make when they do their Astaire Rogers number in Pennies from Heaven. So the culture has changed from 1981. I wish that somebody would show Pennies from Heaven on a big screen again. It deserves that. But I just wonder if the contemporary audience is ready for it or capable of appreciating it.
We may never find out, but I would love to be able to find out because
Sure, me too.
One of my dreams now is to see Pennies from Heaven on a big screen at some point before I die. But I got to run.
Okay.
But not before perhaps teasing what I hope is going to be another conversation between us coming up soon, because there's a new film out now, a new 2024 film called Rebel Moon Part 2. I don't know if you've seen it. Have you watched it yet? It only just came out like a day or two ago.
I was fortunate enough to see it on the big screen.
Oh, so you saw part 1 and 2 on the big screen. Okay.
I saw both of them as movies. Yes.
All right. Well, we'll have to talk about, we got to talk about part 1 a little bit because it was sort of a tag onto another show, but I want to get into a deep dive on parts 1 and 2. I haven't seen the second one yet. I'm going to watch it this week, but yeah, we got to talk about that coming up soon.
All right.
And also, what do you have, anything you want to plug as far as like a new piece in the National Review or anything to look out for?
Well, this week, Friday, I was able to post a piece on the Guy Ritchie film, The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare.
Okay.
I'm off and on with Guy Ritchie, but I think this is a good one.
Really?
Yeah.
All right. I haven't watched it yet, but it's good to have an endorsement because I was kind of iffy on the trailer.
Sure. Well, he's hit or miss.
Yeah.
But this is a good one, I think.
Okay. Cool.
And actually a good companion piece to Rebel Moon Scar Giver in a certain way, and we can discuss that later.
Okay, I thought you were going to say a good companion piece to Pennies from Heaven, which would have me doubly intrigued.
If only Henry Cavill could sing.
We don't know that he can't, though.
Well, that's true. That's true.
All right, sir. Well, thank you very much. I know this will hopefully be invisible to the watchers, but we had some technical difficulties which we kind of fought through. But I'm glad we did, because this has been a very enlightening, sometimes contentious kind of conversation. But I think we're still friends, so so I appreciate it,
Sure.
man. Thank you.
Surely. I appreciate it too. All right, Ian. Talk to you again soon.
All
Okay.
right, take care, man. Thanks. Bye.
All right.